The vise is still bolted to the edge of the bench. Heavy, cold, paint worn down to raw iron where hands kept grabbing the same spot for 30 years. You spin the handle and it moves slow, steady, like it's thinking about it. No wobble, no rattle. Just steel sliding against steel the way it was meant to. Now look at the tiny stamp on the side. Not a logo you'd recognize today, just a city name, a year, 1954. That's it. No slogan, no lifetime warranty badge, no Pro Series, no plastic anywhere. And here's the part that messes with you. That vise has outlived 3 garages, 2 owners, and an entire factory that doesn't even exist anymore. Meanwhile, the shiny one at the hardware store down the road, it'll crack at the base if you lean on it wrong. So what changed? People love to say, they just made things better back then. But that's lazy. That's nostalgia talking. Steel doesn't magically become braver in the 1950s. Bolts don't grow morals. Something else happened. If you lean closer to this old machine, you can see it. The casting lines are thick. The walls are overbuilt. There's more metal than it technically needs. The handle is solid bar stock, not hollow tube. Even the screw threads are deeper than necessary. It's almost wasteful. That's the first clue. Back then, durability wasn't a marketing angle. It was survival. Factories in places like Ohio, Sheffield, Essen, they weren't chasing quarterly spikes. They were chasing reputation. If your vise cracked, word traveled, fast, and you didn't have global shipping to hide behind. The design philosophy was simple. Build it once so it doesn't come back, not because they were saints, because returns killed profit. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. In the late 1960s and early 70s, something shifted, quietly. No press conference, no big announcement, just a different conversation happening in boardrooms. Engineers used to run the room, the guys who cared about stress loads and fatigue limits, the guys who added extra thickness just in case. Then finance people started running the room. And finance doesn't care if your grandson can still use it. Finance cares how many units move this quarter. That's where the tiny flaw enters the story. Not a crack in the metal, not a bad bolt, a spreadsheet decision. They realize something dangerous. If a tool lasts forever, you only sell it once, and that's not growth. So the walls got thinner. Just a little. The alloy changed. Not enough to fail immediately. Just enough to save a few cents per unit. The handle became hollow. The threads became shallower. Still functional. Still safe, technically. But no longer immortal. And here's the psychological trap no one talks about. When products stopped lasting forever, customers didn't notice at first. Because the failure didn't happen in the store. It happened 5 years later, 10 years later. Outside the return window, outside the warranty, quietly. By then, the factory had already shipped millions more. That's the pivot beginning to form. Not a dramatic explosion, not a machine shattering on day one. Just a slow lowering of the bar. And the global part? That came next. Once durability stopped being sacred, location stopped mattering. If you're already thinning the casting and swapping the alloy, why not move production somewhere cheaper? Labor costs drop, shipping gets optimized, margins climb. And here's the twist. Global manufacturing didn't collapse overnight. It became efficient, brilliant even, lean, fast, responsive. But the goal changed. The old goal was endurance. The new goal was replacement. That's a subtle shift, but it rewired everything. Supply chains, quality checks, even how engineers were trained. Instead of asking, how long can this last? They started asking, how long does it need to last? There's a difference. One question builds heirlooms, the other builds cycles. Stand in front of your grandpa's tool chest and you're staring at the fossil record of that change. Wrenches with weight, screwdrivers with shafts that don't flex, a hand drill that hums instead of screams. Most of those companies are gone now, bought, merged, stripped for brand value. The names live on, stamped on lighter versions of themselves. So when people say they don't make them like they used to, they're not wrong. But they're also not asking the right question. The real question is this: when did we decide that lasting too long was a problem? There's an old electric drill sitting under that vise. Not cordless, not sleek. It's got a thick rubber cord that feels like it could tow a car. The body is metal, not plastic. You pull the trigger and it doesn't whine. It growls. Inside that thing is a motor wound with more copper than it strictly needed. Big windings, heavy rotor, bearings you can actually replace, brushes you can swap out with a screwdriver, and 10 minutes of patience. That drill wasn't designed to be opened once and thrown away. It was designed to be repaired. That's the second clue. Repair used to be part of the plan. Companies printed exploded diagrams in the box. Every screw had a part number. Local hardware stores stocked the pieces. There were small repair shops on corners where guys rebuilt motors the way people rebuild engines now. And then, something changed again. Not the motor, not the physics, the casing. Plastic crept in. At first, it made sense. Lighter weight, no rusts, lower costs. Injection molding meant faster production. It looked modern, clean, safe. But plastic did something metal never did. It hid the guts. Once the shell stopped being serviceable, the inside stopped being sacred. Bearings got smaller. Windings got thinner. Heat tolerance dropped. Not enough to fail instantly, just enough to shorten the life curve. The motor would run hot for years, slowly cooking itself from the inside out. You wouldn't notice it the first day. You wouldn't notice it the first year. Then, one afternoon, mid-project, you'd squeeze the trigger and get a smell. That faint, burnt scent, a pause, a stutter, and that would be it. Not catastrophic, just done. That moment right there, that's the pivot point for modern tools. Because it wasn't a design accident, it was a tolerance decision. Engineers know exactly how long insulation lasts at certain temperatures. They know how bearing size affects lifespan. There are charts for this. Decades of data. You can build a motor to last 40 years, or 8. The math isn't mysterious. So when the new generation of drills started dying just outside warranty windows, it wasn't bad luck. It was calibration. And here's where the long-term impact starts to sting. Once products stopped being repairable, skills started disappearing. Why learn to rebuild a motor if the casing is glued shut? Why stock spare parts if the manufacturer doesn't sell them? Local repair shops closed. Not because people stopped breaking things, because breaking things became final. That shift rippled outward. Communities that once had small-scale tool factories and repair hubs began hollowing out. Production moved offshore. Parts became proprietary. Screws turned into custom shapes, so you couldn't open the case without a special bit. It sounds small. A different screw head, a sealed battery pack. But that's how craftsmanship erodes, not with a bang. With a torque screw, and global standards followed the money. When manufacturing scaled across continents, contracts were negotiated to the cent. Every gram of copper, every millimeter of wall thickness became a cost target. If you shave 2 cents off a unit and ship 10 million units, that's real money. Durability became negotiable. The old factories built margin into material. The new system built margin into volume. And here's the quiet consequence no one likes to admit. When you expect something to fail, you treat it differently. You don't oil it, you don't maintain it, you don't pass it down, you use it hard and replace it. That mindset bleeds into everything. Furniture, appliances, even houses. The culture of maintenance fades. Instead of asking, how do I fix this? We ask, where's the nearest replacement? That psychological shift is bigger than plastic casings. It's a rewiring of how we relate to objects. And once that rewiring happens, companies don't have to force obsolescence. We accept it. But here's the uncomfortable bridge. What if durability didn't die because we were tricked? What if it died because we wanted cheaper more than we wanted forever? Stand there for a second with that old metal drill in your hand. Feel the weight. Then ask yourself what it would cost, not in dollars, but in habits, to bring that standard back. Pull open the top drawer of that old tool chest and you'll find something even quieter than the drill. A tape measure, not flashy. No rubber armor, no magnetic hook, just a steel blade with numbers etched deep enough to survive decades of thumbs sliding over them. You stretch it out, and it doesn't kink. The spring inside pulls it back with a smooth snap, not that tired slap you hear from modern ones after a year. Here's the strange thing. A tape measure is simple. It's a coiled strip of steel and a spring. That's it. There's no microchip, no battery, no software update waiting to break it. And yet, modern ones fail all the time. The blade bends and stays bent. The hook loosens. The spring loses tension. After a few drops, the case cracks and the whole thing rattles like it's full of gravel. So, what happened to something that basic? The answer isn't dramatic. It's tension. In the old days, the internal spring was overbuilt. More coils, higher grade steel. That meant stronger retraction and longer life. But it also meant more material, more machining time, and a slightly higher cost per unit. When global manufacturing scaled in the late 20th century, even tiny components like springs became targets. Not because they were failing, because they were too strong for the minimum requirement. That phrase, minimum requirement, is the ghost in this story. A tape measure doesn't need to survive 30 years to function. It just needs to survive long enough to feel worth the price. That's the threshold. And here's the pivot point for this chapter. Picture a meeting room. A cost analyst points at a chart. Spring steel prices are up. The engineer says, if we reduce coil count by 2 turns and slightly lower the temper, we'll still meet performance standards. He's not lying. It will still retract, it will still pass testing, but it won't last 3 decades. In slow motion, that's how endurance dies, not in failure tests, in success tests that only measure the short term. Once standards are written around acceptable lifespan instead of maximum lifespan, everything shifts. Suppliers compete to hit that exact mark. Not better, not worse, just enough. And when every company chases just enough, the floor becomes the ceiling. Here's the part that reaches beyond tools. Global manufacturing standards used to be built around pride and over-engineering. Now, with worldwide logistics and online marketplaces, brands can pivot, rebrand, relaunch. A damaged reputation isn't fatal anymore. It's a line item, so durability stops being armor. It becomes optional. And consumers, trained by years of lower prices and faster turnover, adapt. We stop expecting permanence. We expect upgrades, new models. Version 2.0. The idea of a single object surviving your entire working life starts to feel unrealistic, almost inconvenient, because permanence ties you down. Replacement keeps you shopping. There's something deeper happening here. When tools lasted forever, they carried memory. The nicks on the handle, the faded markings, they were a record of work done. Projects finished, mistakes made and corrected. A tool that survives decades becomes part of a person's identity. But if everything is temporary, memory has nowhere to stick. The long-term impact isn't just economic, it's emotional, it's cultural. We lost repair skills, we lost local factories, but we also lost continuity. And here's the question that should make you uneasy. If every object around you is designed to be temporary, what does that teach you about commitment? Stand there in that garage again. Look at the old vise, the drill, the tape measure. They weren't just built to work, they were built to stay. So when staying stopped being profitable, who decided leaving was better? There's one more thing sitting on that bench. An old cast iron hand plane. Heavy enough that when you set it down, the wood underneath feels it. The blade inside is thick, not razor thin, not disposable. You sharpen it, you tune it, you adjust it with your hands, not a firmware update. You slide it across a piece of hardwood and it doesn't scream. It whispers. Long, curling ribbons fall to the floor like something alive. Now here's the quiet truth. That plane doesn't need electricity. It doesn't need a battery pack. It doesn't need a charger that'll be discontinued in 6 years. It just needs steel and patience. So why did it almost disappear? Because speed won. When portable electric planers and mass-produced power tools flooded the market, they promised efficiency, faster cuts, less labor, more output per hour. And for factories, that mattered. For contractors on tight deadlines, that mattered. But here's the piece nobody says out loud. Speed changes standards. When production cycles shrink, craftsmanship adjusts downward to match them. You don't spend an hour tuning a hand plane if you're billing by the job and racing the clock. You grab the powered version. You move on, and companies saw that shift coming. Why sell one heirloom plane every 30 years when you can sell powered units, replacement blades, new battery systems, upgraded models? The math was obvious. The margins were higher. The turnover was faster. So the old factories that made thick cast iron planes either modernized or died. Many tried to compete by cutting corners, thinner castings, lighter bodies, cheaper steel, same name stamped on the side, different soul inside. And here's the final pivot point. It wasn't that hand planes stopped working. It's that they stopped fitting the economic system. An object that lasts forever slows consumption. It interrupts repeat sales. It weakens the growth curve. So durability didn't collapse because engineers forgot how to build. It collapsed because longevity became a threat to scale. Global manufacturing standards didn't fall apart in chaos. They recalibrated around velocity, around volume, around predictable replacement cycles. And once investors began rewarding growth above all else, companies that built for permanence looked inefficient, old-fashioned, uncompetitive. The aftermath is subtle. Your grandpa's tools still sit in garages, outlasting the brands that made them. Meanwhile, modern equivalents come and go, redesigned every few years, lighter, shinier, slightly cheaper. We gained convenience. We gained accessibility. Tools are affordable to more people now than ever before. But we traded something. We traded objects that could anchor a lifetime for objects that orbit a moment. And here's the part that stays with you when the garage door closes. Those old tools weren't just metal and wood. They were proof that someone expected the future to exist long enough to justify building for it. When durability stopped being the goal, it wasn't just steel that got thinner. It was our belief in keeping things. The vise will probably still be there long after the newest power tool on the shelf burns out. And one day, someone will pick it up, feel the weight, and realize it wasn't magic. It was a choice. A choice to build something that didn't need to be replaced. And somewhere along the line, we decided that was no longer the point. What disappeared wasn't just indestructible tools, it was the future they assumed we'd care enough to deserve.